Have you ever had a moment so humiliating it felt like the world stopped? For Madeline Pryor, a 24-year-old waitress with dreams bigger than her bank account. That moment came when the city's most feared billionaire, Donovan Kincaid, recoiled from her handshake as if she were poison. The public rejection cost her more than just her pride. It cost her job, her hope, and nearly her future. But what Donovan Kincaid didn't know was that in that fleeting, cruel moment, he hadn't just insulted a waitress. He had set in motion a chain of events that would unravel his own carefully constructed world, unearthing a ghost from his past and forcing him to confront a truth he'd buried for years. This isn't a story about a simple apology. It's about how one shattered moment led to an astonishing act of redemption that no one saw coming. The air in Aurelia, a restaurant so exclusive it didn't have a sign, was thick with the scent of money. It smelled of aged leather, imported lilies, and a faint, almost metallic aroma of ambition. For Madeline Pryor, it smelled of survival. Each night she tied the starched, bone-white apron around her waist and became a ghost, a silent, efficient presence gliding between tables laden with foam reductions and gold leaf-dusted desserts. Her feet, squeezed into sensible but unforgiving black shoes, broadcast a dull ache that radiated up her calves. It was a familiar pain, a nightly reminder of the 16-hour days she pulled between this job and a morning shift at a greasy spoon diner. Every dollar was a soldier in her private war against a mountain of debt, a war waged on behalf of her mother Brenda, whose body was slowly being betrayed by multiple sclerosis. But Aurelia was more than just a paycheck. It was a window into a world she desperately wanted to enter, not as a servant, but as a creator. Tucked into her locker beneath her worn-out coat was a sketchbook filled with graphite dreams. Buildings that breathed homes, that harvested rain, community centers powered by the sun. She wasn't just a waitress. She was an architect, in waiting her mind, a blueprint of sustainable, beautiful spaces. Her ultimate goal, the shimmering mirage on her horizon, was a master's degree from the Pratt Institute in New York. The acceptance letter felt like a fantasy, the tuition fee a life sentence. Tonight, the tension in Aurelia was strung even tighter than usual. Table 7, the coveted corner booth with a panoramic view of the city's glittering skyline, was reserved for Donovan Kincaid. The name was spoken in hushed, reverential tones by the staff. Kincaid was not just rich. He was a force of nature, a corporate titan who reshaped skylines with the stroke of a pen. His company, Kincaid Holdings, was a leviathan of real estate and tech, and Kincaid himself was a man forged from granite and ice. Stories about him were legend. He'd once fired an executive for using the wrong font in a memo. He hadn't taken a vacation in 15 years, and he never ever showed weakness. Madeline was assigned his table. Her manager, a perpetually stressed man named Mr. Dubois, had pulled her aside. Pryor. He'd hissed his breath smelling of stale coffee. Not a single mistake. Mr. Kincaid is closing a merger tonight. The men with him are from the Tanabe Corporation in Tokyo. This dinner is worth more than this entire restaurant. Don't speak unless spoken to. Be invisible. Got it. Yes, Mr. Dubois. Madeline had replied, her voice a calm counterpoint to the frantic thumping of her heart. The party arrived at precisely 8:00 p.m. Donovan Kincaid was exactly as imposing as the legends claimed. He was tall, with sharp, tailored lines that made his suit look like a second skin. His hair was a disciplined silver at the temples, his face a mask of cold neutrality. He moved with an unnerving stillness, his eyes missing nothing. He was flanked by his loyal, ever-present Chief of Staff, Jeffrey, and 2 Japanese businessmen who bowed slightly, their faces impassive. For 2 hours, Madeline was the perfect ghost. She refilled water glasses before they were empty, cleared plates with silent grace, and described the amuse-bouche with quiet professionalism. She watched as Kincaid dominated the conversation, his voice a low, commanding rumble. He was charming when he needed to be ruthless, when he corrected a detail in the contract laid out on the table. He was a predator, and this dinner was his hunting ground. The deal was closing. A quiet energy of triumph settled over the table. Mr. Tanabe, the elder of the two Japanese men, smiled for the first time all evening. He raised his glass of vintage Bordeaux. To a prosperous future, Kincaid-san. As Kincaid set his own glass down, his elbow nudged the rim of a fresh glass of water Madeline had just placed. Time seemed to slow. The crystal goblet tipped a graceful, lethal arc of water, splashing directly onto the corner of the merger agreement, the very page bearing the signature lines. A collective gasp sucked the air from the table. The ink on the page began to feather and blur. Mr. Dubois, watching from across the room, went pale. Madeline's training kicked in. She didn't panic. In a fluid, swift motion, she placed her silver serving tray under the dripping edge of the table, catching the excess water before it could reach anyone's lap. "My deepest apologies, sir," she said, her voice steady, as she produced a pristine, folded linen napkin from her apron. With the precise care of a surgeon, she blotted the water from the precious document, carefully lifting the moisture without smearing the ink. In less than 10 seconds, the crisis was averted. The page was slightly damp, but the signatures would be salvageable. She had saved the multi-billion-dollar moment. A wave of relief washed over the table. Jeffrey gave her a small, appreciative nod. Mr. Tanabe even chuckled softly. "Excellent reflexes, young lady." Donovan Kincaid, however, just stared at the damp spot, his jaw tight. He hadn't looked at Madeline once. As the businessmen began gathering their things, their conversation, now light and celebratory, Madeline returned to clear the last of the dessert plates. She had done her job. She had weathered the storm. A small, unfamiliar surge of pride welled within her. She had faced the dragon in his lair and held her own. Feeling a sudden human impulse to properly close the encounter, and perhaps emboldened by Mr. Tanabe's praise, she did something she had never done before. As Donovan Kincaid stood up preparing to leave, she turned to him. "Mr. Kincaid," she said, her voice clear and respectful. "It was an honor to serve you and your guests this evening. I wish you all the best with your new partnership." And then she extended her hand. It was a simple, universal gesture of goodwill, a bridge between two people. The reaction was instantaneous and brutal. Donovan Kincaid looked down at her outstretched hand as if she had offered him a viper. His face, already a cold mask, contorted into a flash of genuine disgust. He physically recoiled, pulling his own hand back and tucking it against his chest as if to protect it from contamination. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. His eyes, cold and sharp as splintered ice, did the talking. They sliced through her, branding her with a humiliation so profound, so public, that it stole the air from her lungs. The gesture screamed, "You are nothing. You are unclean. How dare you presume to touch me?" The moment stretched into an eternity. The happy chatter at the table died. Jeffrey's face tightened with something that looked like pained recognition. The two Japanese businessmen froze, their cultural sensibilities jarred by the blatant disrespect. The entire restaurant, it seemed, was watching. Madeline felt the blood drain from her face. Her hand remained suspended in the air for a heartbeat, a monument to her miscalculation, before she slowly, mechanically let it fall to her side. It felt impossibly heavy. She wanted the polished floor to swallow her whole. Without another glance, Donovan Kincaid turned and strode out of the restaurant, his entourage trailing in his wake like pilot fish behind a great white shark. The silence he left behind was deafening. It was broken only by the furious marching footsteps of Mr. Dubois. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her bicep, and dragged her towards his office. "Are you insane?" He seethed, his face a mottled purple. "What in God's name did you think you were doing? You don't touch the clients. You don't speak to them, and you certainly do not offer your filthy waitress hand to a man like Donovan Kincaid. Mr. Dubois, I was just trying to be polite. You were trying to get fired," he snarled, shoving her towards the door. "And congratulations, you succeeded. Get your things. You're done. I don't want to see your face here ever again." Stunned, Madeline could only stammer, "But I saved the contract." "You embarrassed a billionaire," he retorted, his voice dripping with venom. "In his world, that's a mortal sin. Now get out." She stumbled back to the locker room, the ghost of Kincaid's disgust clinging to her like a shroud. Her hands were trembling, not from anger, but from a deep cellular shame. She peeled off the white apron, now a symbol of her disgrace, and grabbed her coat and her precious sketchbook. As she stepped out of the alleyway behind Aurelia and into the cold night air, the city's glittering towers seemed to mock her. They were Kincaid's world, a world of power and glass and steel, with no room for a girl with calloused hands and a useless dream. The handshake, the refusal, the firing, it all blurred into one searing memory. He hadn't just refused her hand, he had crushed her spirit. The first week after the firing was a study in freefall. Madeline's life, once a precarious but stable structure of shifts and obligations, collapsed into a shapeless void of anxiety. The city, which had once felt full of promise, now felt like a concrete prison. Every job posting for a high-end restaurant seemed to mock her. Experience required. Impeccable references essential. What could she say? I was fired for attempting to shake a billionaire's hand. The diner shifts became her only lifeline, the smell of burnt coffee and sizzling bacon a grim reality check. The money was a trickle, not a stream, and the mountain of her mother's medical bills grew taller with each passing day. A new experimental drug had been recommended by Brenda's doctors, a flicker of hope with a price tag that might as well have been $1 billion. "Don't you worry about me, Maddie girl," Brenda would say from her armchair, her voice thin but cheerful over the phone. She always tried to sound strong, a performance of wellness that broke Madeline's heart. "We'll manage. We always do." But they weren't managing. Madeline would look at her sketchbook, at the elegant lines of a low-income housing unit with a rooftop garden, and feel a bitter laugh bubble in her chest. Who was she kidding? She couldn't even manage her own rent, let alone redesign the world. The Pratt Institute letter was tucked away in a drawer, a cruel reminder of a future that was now officially impossible. One rainy afternoon, huddled in a corner of a small coffee shop, nursing a single cup for over an hour, she took out the sketchbook. It was her only therapy. She began to draw, losing herself in the cross-hatching of a facade, the curve of a sustainable roof. She designed a community clinic, nestled in a poor neighborhood. It was open-airy, with a central atrium filled with plants designed to be calming, to heal. She poured all her frustration, all her sense of injustice into the drawing. It was a building for people who were ignored, for those who were made to feel small. A building with dignity. Absorbed in her work, she didn't notice the time until the barista politely asked if she needed anything else. Flustered, Madeline packed her things, quickly paid for a refill she couldn't afford, and rushed out into the rain, leaving the sketchbook, her soul bound in paper and graphite, sitting forgotten on the small wooden table. Meanwhile, across town, in a penthouse office that seemed to scrape the clouds, Donovan Kincaid was not celebrating. The Tanabe merger was a triumph, a landmark deal that would be studied in business schools for years. His company's stock had soared, yet an unsettling disquiet had taken root in his mind. It was the girl's eyes. He couldn't shake the memory of them. In the moment he had recoiled, he had seen more than just shock in her eyes. He'd seen a flash of pride, extinguished a deep, wounding hurt that was utterly devoid of anger. It was the look of a spirit being broken, and it haunted him. "The press is having a field day, sir," Geoffrey said, standing before Kincaid's vast obsidian desk. He held a tablet displaying the headlines. "Kincaid seals trillion-yen deal." Everything went perfectly. Kincaid stared out the floor-to-ceiling window, his jaw clenched. Not everything. Geoffrey, who had served Kincaid for 2 decades, knew how to navigate his employer's moods. He had seen the incident at the restaurant, and he had seen the flicker of something ancient and painful in Kincaid's eyes. He knew it wasn't about germs or snobbery. It was about Eleanor. Eleanor, Kincaid's late wife. The name was a ghost that lived in the silent, opulent spaces of Kincaid's life. She had been his opposite warm, where he was cold, compassionate, where he was pragmatic. She was a philanthropist, a believer in people, and she had died 5 years ago, a death Kincaid secretly, privately blamed on himself. The last man he had shaken hands with before her death was Robert Devereux, a partner in a biotech venture Eleanor had championed. Devereux had looked Kincaid in the eye, shaken his hand firmly, and assured him the experimental drug trials were safe, that the funding was secure. A week later, the company collapsed. Devereux vanished with the investment capital. The trials were revealed to be fraudulent, and the drug that might have saved Eleanor, along with dozens of other patients, never materialized. The handshake had become for Kincaid the ultimate symbol of betrayal. A liar's gesture. A promise that meant nothing. Since then, he hadn't willingly shaken a single hand. He wore his aversion like armor, a shield against the memory of his own failure to protect the one person he loved. But the waitress, she wasn't a liar. She was a young woman, doing her job, a woman who had acted with more grace under pressure than most of his executives. His public, cruel rejection of her felt different. It felt unjust. It was the kind of casual cruelty Eleanor had always railed against. "Your buildings are magnificent, Donovan." She used to say, her voice a gentle chide, "but they're just glass and steel. They lack a soul. They don't help the people on the street below." "Geoffrey," Kincaid said, turning from the window, his voice low. "The waitress from Aurelia. What was her name?" Geoffrey's expression remained neutral, but he was surprised. Kincaid never looked back. "I don't know, sir, but I can find out." "Find out," Kincaid commanded. "Find out everything, and find out what happened to her after we left." He rationalized the order as tying up a loose end, a matter of risk management. But deep down, a different motive was stirring. It was the echo of his wife's voice, the memory of the girl's eyes, and a growing, uncomfortable feeling that he had broken something that should have been protected. Geoffrey was efficient and discreet. It took him less than a day. He returned to Kincaid's office with a slim file. "Her name is Madeline Pryor." He began, his tone purely factual. 24 years old. Her mother, Brenda Pryor, has an advanced stage of multiple sclerosis. The medical bills are substantial. Miss Pryor was working 2 jobs to cover them. She was a student of architecture, accepted into the master's program at the Pratt Institute, but was unable to afford the tuition. Kincaid listened, his face unreadable. Geoffrey continued. "She was fired from Aurelia immediately following the incident. The manager cited unprofessional conduct with a high-profile client. Since then, she's been unable to find work in a similar establishment." Each word was a small, sharp stone hitting Kincaid, fired. Because of him. His impulsive, trauma-fueled reaction had dominoed into this young woman's life, shattering her stability, and it seemed her dreams. "There's one more thing, sir," Geoffrey said, his professionalism finally cracking with a hint of something more. He placed a large, slightly worn sketchbook on the gleaming surface of the desk. "I tracked her movements. She frequents a coffee shop on the Lower East Side. She left this behind yesterday by mistake. I took the liberty of retrieving it before it was lost. I believe you need to see it." Kincaid stared at the simple, unassuming sketchbook. "Why?" "Because," Geoffrey said, his gaze steady, "it's not about who she is, sir. It's about who she could be." Hesitantly, as if it might burn him, Donovan Kincaid reached out and opened the sketchbook. The pages of the sketchbook felt alien in Donovan Kincaid's hands. His world was one of glossy prospectuses, digital blueprints, and legally binding contracts. This was different. This was raw, intimate, and profoundly human. The first few pages were filled with skillful but standard renderings of modernist skyscrapers and sleek, minimalist interiors. They were technically excellent, the kind of work he saw from junior architects at his own firm. Competent but soulless. He almost dismissed it. Then the tone of the book changed. He turned a page and was met with a drawing so detailed it felt like a photograph of a place that didn't yet exist. It was the community clinic Madeline had drawn in the coffee shop. The caption in neat, small print read, "The Brenda Pryor Wellness Center." A space for healing, not waiting. Kincaid felt a jolt, a physical shock that ran up his spine. Brenda Pryor, her mother. This wasn't just a design. It was an act of love, a daughter's desperate prayer rendered in graphite. He looked closer. He saw the details his own architects often missed, the ramp gradients designed for easy wheelchair access. The waiting areas broken into smaller private pods to reduce anxiety, the south-facing windows positioned to maximize natural mood-lifting light. A central atrium labeled the Eleanor Garden was filled with therapeutic plants. Eleanor Garden. The name hit him like a physical blow. He felt the air leave his lungs. His Eleanor had been an avid gardener. She had always talked about the healing power of nature, of creating sanctuaries of peace within the cold stone of the city. He could almost hear her voice whispering over his shoulder, "Donovan, this is what I meant." He turned the pages with a new feverish intensity. Each drawing was a revelation, a design for a homeless shelter that looked less like an institution and more like a collection of dignified micro-homes, each with a small private garden patch. A public library for a low-income neighborhood with a sweeping solar-paneled roof that fed energy back into the local grid, reducing utility costs for the entire community. A multi-generational housing project where senior apartments were integrated with affordable family units and a daycare fostering connection and mutual support. Her notes filled the margins. They weren't architectural jargon. They were notes about people. Noise-dampening materials for the walls near the nursery. Textured pathways for the visually impaired. Rooftop cistern to collect rainwater for the community vegetable garden. Reduces water bills and provides fresh food. This wasn't architecture as a monument to wealth or power. This was architecture as an act of service. It was everything his late wife had ever tried to explain to him, everything he had been too busy, too arrogant, too focused on the bottom line to understand. His buildings were landmarks on a map. Madeline Pryor's were landmarks in people's lives. He saw with a clarity that was both humbling and horrifying the scale of his misjudgment. He hadn't just insulted a waitress. He had belittled an artist, a visionary, a young woman with more soul and purpose in her little finger than he had in his entire, multi-billion-dollar empire. And he, with his casual, thoughtless cruelty, had nearly extinguished that light. He had fired her from a job she needed, pushing her further away from a dream that could benefit countless others. "Jeffrey," he said, his voice hoarse. He didn't look up from the sketchbook. "Sir, cancel my afternoon." "All of it, sir?" "You have the quarterly review with the board." "Cancel it," he repeated, his voice harder now, but for a different reason. Not anger, but a sudden burning urgency. He finally looked up at his chief of staff, and for the first time in 5 years, Jeffrey saw something other than grief or ambition in his boss's eyes. He saw purpose. "I need you to do 2 things for me. First, I want you to contact the admissions board at the Pratt Institute. I want to establish an anonymous grant. It will be called the New Vision Scholarship. It will provide a full, unconditional ride, tuition, housing, materials, living expenses for 1 student in the Master of Architecture program. That student is Madeline Pryor. I want the letter on her doorstep by tomorrow morning. She is not to know who it's from. Is that understood?" Jeffrey blinked, stunned by the scale and speed of the command, but he nodded. "Perfectly, sir." Second, Kincaid continued, his gaze returning to the drawing of the wellness center named after Madeline's mother. "I want you to get our legal team, our top philanthropic advisors, and our head of communications. Book the grand ballroom at the Pierre for a press conference a week from today. We are launching a new charitable foundation." Jeffrey was scribbling notes furiously. "A new foundation, sir. What will be the focus?" Donovan Kincaid closed the sketchbook gently, reverently. He thought of his wife's lost dreams and this young woman's brilliant ones. He thought of the handshake, the ultimate symbol of a broken promise, and the new promise he was about to make. A chance to build something that wasn't just glass and steel. A chance to build a legacy Eleanor would have been proud of. "The focus," Kincaid said, a strange, unfamiliar emotion thickening his voice, "will be on people. It will fund and build the kinds of projects you see in this book. Sustainable, community-focused architecture. It will be dedicated to building a better world, 1 dignified space at a time." "A wonderful initiative, sir," Jeffrey said, looking up from his notepad. "What will you call it? The Kincaid Foundation?" Donovan stood and walked to the window, looking down at the city that bore his name on 6 towers. For the first time, they looked empty to him. He was about to give this new venture a name that would bind his past to his future, his grief to his newfound hope. A name that would honor the woman who had inspired him in life and the one who had unknowingly saved him from himself. "No, Jeffrey," he said softly. "We're going to call it the Eleanor Pryor Foundation." The envelope that arrived was thick and embossed with the crest of the Pratt Institute. Madeline saw it in the communal mailbox of her rundown apartment building and assumed it was a final, formal rejection, or perhaps a bill for the application fee she'd paid with her last few dollars. Her heart sank. It was another door slamming shut. She carried it upstairs, her feet dragging with exhaustion after a 12-hour shift at the diner. The apartment was quiet. Her mother was having a good day and was out with a friend from her support group, A Small Mercy. Madeline didn't think she could bear faking a smile for her mother right now. She slit the envelope open with a kitchen knife, her hand still smelling faintly of grease and bleach. She pulled out the heavy letterhead and began to read. "Dear Ms. Pryor, on behalf of the Admissions Committee, exceptional talent, a new scholarship, the New Vision Scholarship, full funding for the entirety of your master's program, including tuition, housing stipend, and all associated costs. Anonymous benefactor, deeply impressed by your potential. We congratulate you and eagerly await your arrival." The words blurred. She read them again. And a third time, it didn't make sense. Full funding, anonymous benefactor. This was the stuff of fairy tales, not the harsh reality of her life. She sank onto her worn-out sofa, the letter trembling in her hand. It felt like a prank, a cruel, elaborate joke. But the letterhead was real. The signature of the dean was real. A wave of disbelief, so potent it felt like dizziness washed over her. Tears welled in her eyes, not tears of sadness, but of a confused, overwhelming joy. It was a miracle, a lifeline thrown to her, just as she was about to drown. Who would do this? She had no rich relatives, no secret admirers. The idea of an anonymous benefactor was so foreign, so outside the realm of her experience, it felt like a message from another planet. The first person she called was her mother. Brenda's shriek of pure, unadulterated happiness was the most beautiful sound Madeline had ever heard. For a few hours, the crushing weight of their life lifted. They celebrated with a cheap bottle of sparkling cider, their tiny apartment filled with laughter and plans for the future. Madeline would go to New York. She would become an architect. She could finally build the wellness center she'd designed for her mum. Maybe not the exact one, but she could learn how. Hope and emotion she thought she'd lost forever came rushing back in a tidal wave. Yet a thread of unease remained. The anonymity of it all was unsettling. Who was watching her? Who knew about her dream with such intimacy that they would fund it so completely? She felt a strange sense of being a character in someone else's story, her life suddenly being written by an invisible hand. A few days later, another envelope arrived. This one was different. It was heavy, cream-colored cardstock delivered by courier. It was an invitation. Mr. Donovan Kincaid requests the pleasure of your company at the inaugural press conference and launch of the Eleanor Pryor Foundation. Madeline stared at the name, her blood running cold. Donovan Kincaid, the man from the restaurant, the source of her deepest humiliation. And then she saw the other name, Pryor, her own last name, linked with a stranger's Eleanor. It was too much of a coincidence. Kincaid, the man who wouldn't touch her hand, was now inviting her to a major event, and the foundation bore her name. It was impossible. It had to be a different Pryor, a common name. It had to be, but the invitation had been sent directly to her, by name. Her first instinct was to throw it away, to pretend it never came. The memory of his revulsion was a fresh wound. Why would she ever want to be in the same room as that man again? But curiosity, a powerful and dangerous force, gnawed at her. The New Vision Scholarship, the Eleanor Pryor Foundation. The pieces of the puzzle were floating around her, and she felt an overwhelming need to see how they fit, even if the final picture was one she wouldn't like. She decided to go. She would be a ghost again, just as she had been at Aurelia. She would stand at the back watch from the shadows and try to understand. The ballroom at the Pierre Hotel was a world away from her tiny apartment. Crystal chandeliers dripped from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls, and the air buzzed with the quiet, confident murmur of the city's elite. Journalists lined the walls, their cameras poised. Business leaders, politicians, and socialites filled the gold-trimmed chairs. Madeline, dressed in her one good black dress, the one she kept for funerals, felt painfully out of place. She clutched her small purse and found a spot near the back, partially hidden by a marble pillar. The lights dimmed. A hush fell over the room. Jeffrey Kincaid's ever-present chief of staff walked to the podium. He gave a brief introduction about the power of philanthropy and the vision for a new era of corporate responsibility. Then he said the words that made Madeline's heart hammer against her ribs. And now it is my distinct honor to introduce the founder and chairman of this new initiative, Mr. Donovan Kincaid. Donovan Kincaid walked onto the stage. He looked different than he had at the restaurant. The armor of icy indifference was gone. He seemed heavier, more human. His eyes scanned the crowd, and for a terrifying second, Madeline felt as if they locked directly onto hers. He cleared his throat, and a silence fell over the room. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice, not the commanding rumble she remembered, but something quieter, more somber. "Most of you know me as a builder, a man who deals in concrete steel and shareholder value. For a long time, I believed that was enough. That building bigger, taller, and more profitable structures was a worthy legacy." He paused, taking a breath. "I was wrong." A ripple of surprise went through the audience. Donovan Kincaid did not admit fault. "A legacy is not what you build," he continued, his gaze distant. "It's what you leave behind in the lives of others. It's a lesson my late wife Eleanor tried to teach me for years. She believed in the soul of a place. She believed that buildings should serve people, not the other way around. She believed in kindness, in dignity, and in offering a hand to those who needed it." He looked down at his own hands, resting on the podium. Madeline found herself staring at them, remembering her own hand left hanging in the empty air. "Recently," he said, his voice dropping slightly, "I was reminded of Eleanor's lesson in a very abrupt way. I had a brief chance encounter with a young woman, a woman of immense talent, quiet dignity, and a vision for a better world that I had long since lost sight of. In a moment of profound arrogance, a moment I deeply regret I failed to see the person in front of me. I saw her station in life, not her soul." Madeline froze behind her pillar, her breath caught in her throat. He was talking about her. He was talking about that night. She felt 100 pairs of eyes, turning, searching, even though no one knew who he was talking about. Her face burned. "This young woman," Kincaid went on, "designs buildings that have what mine have always lacked a heart. She designs places for healing, for community, for learning, places that lift people up. Her work reminded me of Eleanor's dream. It's a dream I let die. Today I am here to bring it back to life." He stood up straighter, his voice regaining its familiar strength, but now it was infused with a new passion. "That is why I am announcing the formation of a new $500 million charitable foundation. Its sole mission will be to fund design and build the kind of architecture that serves humanity. It will create scholarships for students with a similar vision, and it will break ground on its first project, a state-of-the-art wellness center for multiple sclerosis patients and their families within the next year." Madeline's knees felt weak. A wellness center for MS patients. The Brenda Pryor Wellness Center from her sketchbook. It couldn't be. "This foundation," Kincaid declared, his voice ringing with conviction, "is named in honor of two remarkable women. The woman who gave me my past, and the woman who unknowingly showed me my future." He looked out over the sea of faces, his eyes finding the back of the room, finding the pillar, finding her. "It is my honor," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "to introduce the Eleanor Pryor Foundation." The name hit the room like a thunderclap. Pryor. The journalist started murmuring, scribbling frantically. Madeline felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. It was her name entwined with his history, plastered across the biggest philanthropic announcement of the year. But Kincaid wasn't finished. "The foundation's work will be guided by the vision that inspired it, and so we have also awarded our very first scholarship, the New Vision Scholarship, to its most deserving recipient." He was still looking at her. His gaze was an anchor holding her in place. "I would like to ask her to please come forward. Miss Madeline Pryor, would you please join me on stage?" silence. It descended upon the grand ballroom, not as an absence of sound, but as a living entity, a thick, profound presence that absorbed the murmurs, the clinking of glasses, and the rustle of expensive fabrics. Every head in the room, a sea of the city's most influential faces, swiveled in unison, following the line of Donovan Kincaid's gaze. Their eyes traveled past the rows of gilt chairs, past the curious journalists, to the shadowed alcove at the very back of the room, where a woman stood frozen beside a marble pillar. The spotlight, which had been bathing Kincaid in a soft, authoritative glow, swung with unnerving speed and precision. It found Madeline pinning her in its bright, accusatory circle. She felt a gasp lodge in her throat. The pillar she had chosen for its comforting anonymity was now the marker for her sudden, unwilling exposure. For a dizzying moment, she was an animal caught in the hunter's beam, her heart hammering against her ribs with a frantic, primal rhythm. This was a nightmare, a surreal, public unraveling she could never have conceived. She had come here as a ghost, intending to watch from the periphery, to gather the scattered pieces of the puzzle of her life from a safe distance. Instead, Kincaid had reached across the cavernous room and dragged her into the very center of his narrative, making her the unwilling protagonist. Her mind reeled, trying to process the impossible words she had just heard. The Eleanor Pryor Foundation. Her name. Her ordinary, unremarkable name, now fused with that of a ghost from a billionaire's past, plastered across a $500 million enterprise. It felt like a violation, a theft of her identity. He had taken her name without asking, just as he had taken her dignity that night at Aurelia. She saw him on the stage, waiting. His face, stripped of its usual ironclad composure, was an open book of anticipation, and in his eyes she saw it a flicker of raw, undisguised fear. He had gambled everything on this moment. In front of the world's media, in front of his board members and rivals, he had made himself vulnerable. He had laid down his pride, his power, his reputation, and waited for her verdict. If she turned, if she fled, his grand gesture would not just fail. It would backfire spectacularly, transforming his intended redemption into a public spectacle of rejection, confirming him as the monster he was trying to shed. A war ignited within her, fierce and instantaneous. Run screamed the part of her that still burned with the fresh, searing memory of his disgust, the part that remembered the weight of her hand falling to her side, the cold sting of Mr. Dubois' fingers on her arm, the hollow echo of the alleyway after she'd been fired. This is just another power play. He's using your story, your humiliation as a prop. Don't let him buy you. Don't let him turn your pain into his salvation. Your dignity is your own. Walk out that door and keep it. But another voice, quieter and more measured, fought through the rage. It was the voice that had sketched blueprints while her world fell apart. It was the voice of the architect. It urged her to look at the full design, not just the painful cornerstone. It reminded her of the thick envelope from Pratt, the impossible scholarship that had felt like a divine miracle. It whispered the name of the Foundation's first project, a wellness center for multiple sclerosis patients, a sanctuary for her mother. A dream she had poured onto a page, a prayer she never believed would be answered. He hadn't just seen a waitress to be pitied. He had seen her work. He had opened her sketchbook and understood the language of her soul. This wasn't just an apology for an insult. It was an acknowledgement of her vision. The Foundation wasn't just a salve for his conscience. It was a platform for her dreams. She was standing at a crossroads. One path led back to the shadows, preserving her pride, but leaving her dreams in the dust. The other path led into the blinding light of the stage, towards a future she could never have imagined, but it required her to walk through the fire of her own humiliation one last time. It required forgiveness. Slowly, as if her shoes were welded to the floor, she forced one foot in front of the other. She pushed herself away from the pillar, stepping out of the shadows and into the full, shocking glare of the light. A collective intake of breath rippled through the room, followed by a frantic storm of camera flashes. The sound was like a physical assault, a battery of tiny explosions that made her flinch. She kept her eyes locked on Kincaid. He was the only steady point in a universe that had suddenly tilted on its axis. The walk down the center aisle was the longest of her life. Each step was a conscious, deliberate decision. The faces she passed were a blur of expressions: astonishment, admiration, pity, raw curiosity. She felt their gazes on her simple black dress, on her flushed face, on her trembling hands. She was no longer Madeline Pryor, the waitress. She was no longer an anonymous face in the crowd. In the span of Kincaid's speech, he had rewritten her identity for everyone in this room. Now it was up to her to decide if she would accept it. As she reached the stage, the steps seemed to loom like a cliff face. Jeffrey Kincaid's ever-present aide was there, his hand outstretched to help her up. His professional mask was gone, replaced by a look of genuine, profound respect. As his fingers clasped hers, he leaned in and murmured his voice, a low, earnest whisper meant only for her. "Miss Pryor, thank you." In his eyes she understood. He wasn't just thanking her for coming to the stage. He was the one who had found the sketchbook. He was the bridge. He was thanking her for giving his boss a chance to become a better man. She ascended the final steps and stood on the stage facing Donovan Kincaid. The heat from the lights was intense. The silence from the hundreds of onlookers was a physical pressure. They stood a few feet apart, the space between them crackling with the memory of their first meeting and the electric potential of their second. He took a step closer, closing the distance. He did seem smaller up close without his armor of wealth and arrogance. He looked like a man carrying a heavy burden. "Miss Pryor," he said, his voice quiet and raw, yet it carried with perfect clarity through the microphones. "I know that no words can fully undo the disrespect I showed you. My actions were inexcusable." He looked directly into her eyes, and she saw no deceit, only a deep, weary regret. They were born from a private pain, but that is an explanation, not an excuse. I was wrong. The simple, unadorned admission hung in the air. He wasn't trying to justify himself. He was simply confessing his failure. "Your work," he continued, his voice gaining a flicker of the passion she'd hoarded earlier. "Your vision. It reminded me of a dream I thought was buried forever. You design buildings with a soul. You showed me what it means to build with purpose again. Not for profit, but for people." Then he did it. He performed the act that had started this entire chain of events, but this time it was transformed. He extended his hand, the same hand that had recoiled from her as if from a leper. This time it did not pull back. It reached out. It was not a gesture of dismissal, but of invitation. A plea. She saw the slightest tremor in his fingers, the taut line of his jaw. He was terrified. "Miss Madeline Pryor," he said, his voice ringing with a powerful, desperate sincerity that cut through her last defenses. "I am asking you to be the first partner of the Eleanor Pryor Foundation. I am asking for your forgiveness, and I am asking if you would do me the profound honor of accepting my apology and my handshake." The world stopped. It was just the two of them, suspended in a moment of impossible grace. She looked down at his outstretched hand. She thought of her mother, whose future now held the promise of comfort and care. She thought of the halls of Pratt, a world that was now hers to enter. She thought of the clinics and community centers she would now have the power to bring to life. He wasn't just offering an apology. He was offering her the tools to build her dreams, dreams he had almost crushed. He had taken the worst moment of her life and was attempting to turn it into the foundation of her best future. Forgiveness, she realized in that instant, was not weakness. It was not submission. It was its own form of power. It was the power to release the past, to claim the future, and to choose creation over destruction. A small, genuine smile, the first she had felt in weeks, touched her lips. Slowly, deliberately, she raised her own hand. It was not the trembling, uncertain hand of a shamed waitress. It was the steady, confident hand of an architect, the hand of a partner, the hand of a woman who knew her own worth. She placed her hand in his. His grip was firm, warm, and real. It was a connection, not a transaction. As their hands clasped, a thunderous wave of applause erupted from the ballroom, a roar of approval and release. The camera flashes exploded in a final blinding crescendo, capturing the image that would define them, both the Titan and the Dreamer, their hands linked in a pact of forgiveness, redemption, and a breathtaking new beginning. 2 years later, the first rays of morning sun struck the glass atrium of the Brenda Pryor Wellness Center. The building was exactly as Madeline had drawn it in her sketchbook, only now it was real, tangible, and filled with light. Inside, patients sat not in anxious rows, but in comfortable alcoves, surrounded by the greenery of the Eleanor Garden. The building breathed, it healed. Madeline, now in her final year at Pratt, and an active consultant for the foundation, stood on a balcony overlooking the garden. She was no longer a ghost in a gilded cage. She was the architect of this sanctuary. Her mother, whose condition had stabilized and improved dramatically with the care the center provided, was downstairs volunteering her laughter, echoing in the space her daughter had designed. Donovan Kincaid was there too. He wasn't the man she had met at Aurelia. The ice in his veins had melted. He visited the center often, not as a benefactor checking on his investment, but as a man finding solace. He knew the patients by name. He spent his afternoons talking to them, listening to their stories. He was building a different kind of empire now, one measured in lives touched, not dollars earned. His relationship with Madeline was one of deep professional respect and a quiet, unspoken friendship. They were partners bound by a shared mission. They rarely spoke of that night at the restaurant, but it was always there, an invisible foundation upon which everything else had been built. One afternoon, as they stood on that same balcony, Kincaid turned to her. "You know," he said, his voice soft. "Eleanor always said, I collected things, companies, buildings, art. She said I never truly connected with any of it. She would have loved this. She would have loved you." Madeline smiled, a genuine, easy smile. "I think," she said, looking out at the thriving garden, "she's here in all of this." Donovan nodded, a rare peace settling on his features. He looked at Madeline, the young woman whose dignity he had once attacked and who had, in turn, saved him from his own gilded cage. He saw the future, and for the first time in a very long time, it looked bright. He extended his hand, a familiar, easy gesture between them now. "To the next project, Miss Pryor." She took it without hesitation, their handshakes sealing not a business deal, but a promise. A promise to keep building, to keep dreaming, and to always, always see the soul within. This story is a powerful reminder that our lives can change in an instant, not just through hardship, but through unexpected acts of grace and redemption. Madeline's journey from a humiliated waitress to a visionary architect wasn't just about receiving a gift. It was about her unshakable dignity, inspiring a profound change in someone else. It shows us that beneath the surface of titles and wealth, we are all human, capable of both great cruelty and even greater kindness. It's a testament to the idea that it's never too late to right a wrong, and that the most valuable things we can build aren't made of steel and glass, but of purpose and compassion. If this story moved you, please give this video a like and share it with someone who might need a reminder of the power of hope. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories that inspire and uplift. What did you think of Donovan Kincaid's transformation? Let us know in the comments below.